I still remember the smell of jasmine and too much expensive perfume. It was my brother's engagement, a meticulously staged affair where the spotlights were as carefully positioned as the guests. Everything was polished, the silver, the banter, and the lie my family had comfortably nestled into for years. "Oh, that's just my sister, Serafina," my brother Julian announced, waving me over with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He was beaming, standing beside his fiancée, Brielle, a woman with a smile as bright and strategic as a corporate merger. "She's our reliable one, works down at the city records office." A polite, distant murmur rippled through the small knot of guests. Julian, the successful investment banker, always knew how to introduce me in a way that guaranteed a quick change of subject. It was a neat, non-threatening label. City Records Office. It sounded like filing papers and early retirement, the perfect background noise to his brilliant career. Brielle, however, didn't join the easy flow of conversation. She turned, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed slightly, her gaze sharp and assessing. She studied me for a long moment, a flicker of something I couldn't place crossing her eyes. "Serafina," she finally asked, her voice calm and level, "what specifically is your role at the records office?" My chest tightened with that familiar, stinging heat. The urge to shrink, to mumble a vague answer and escape was almost overwhelming. But this time something felt different. The safety of the lie which I had maintained for years to keep the peace suddenly felt heavier than the truth. I looked at Brielle, at Julian's impatient, superior smile, and at the faces of my parents who were already looking away, signaling that the matter was closed. I didn't defend myself, I didn't offer an explanation, I only said one word. And the silence that followed wasn't a pause, it was an absence. It was the sound of my family's entire perception of me shattering. The comfort of a simple lie. For as long as I could remember, my family celebrated the dazzling and the loud. Julian was the inheritor of the family's ambition, a whirlwind of risk and reward, and I, Serafina, was content to be the quiet, dependable one. I accepted the label of the records office administrator because it was easy. It let them move on. "Still doing the clerical work, dear?" my aunt would ask, patting my hand with pity. I'd nod and smile. It was easier than explaining the truth, which always seemed to make people, especially Julian, intensely uncomfortable. My grandmother Eliza was the only one who seemed to look past the veneer. She noticed the way I carried myself, the precision in my voice when I ordered dinner, the quick, complex notes I occasionally jotted down on the back of receipts. She would only smile faintly, a knowing glint in her eyes, a silent pledge of alliance. I rationalized my silence as an act of selfless peacekeeping. I told myself I didn't need their validation. But every time Julian reduced my professional life to a punchline, a small, cold resolve hardened inside me. The night the truth demanded a seat. The engagement dinner was a spectacle of white flowers and crystal, the perfect backdrop for Julian's ascendancy. I was early, per usual. My mother immediately enlisted me to manage the seating chart and check coats, a role that kept me busy and, more importantly, out of the spotlight. Later, during the toasts, the conversation swirled around Julian's latest corporate victory, a multi-million-dollar negotiation that had dominated family discussions for weeks. Julian raised his champagne flute, his eyes sweeping the room, stopping finally on me. "Some of us are making the big decisions that shape the market," he announced with a performative chuckle, nodding toward a friend who was a CEO. "And some of us," he paused for emphasis, "are making sure the documents are filed correctly." My parents offered obligatory, polite laughter. The familiar heat flared in my cheeks. But as I mentally prepared to disappear again, Brielle intervened. She turned to me, her attention completely focused, overriding Julian's carefully scripted narrative. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Serafina, what exactly do you do at the courthouse? I mean the records office." The table fell silent. The question, so simple and direct, felt like a thunderclap. Every eye was on me, waiting for the small, neat answer they expected. The lie was exposed, trembling in the spotlight. I felt the weight of years of calculated invisibility pressing down on me. I looked at my hands, at the grain of the polished mahogany table, and I realized that my silence hadn't protected anyone. It had simply preserved a fragile, outdated hierarchy. I would not shrink anymore. The word. I met Brielle's gaze, then Julian's, and then my parents'. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer a defense. I simply set my champagne flute down with a quiet clink that echoed in the sudden, deep stillness. I said one word. "Prosecutor." It was delivered like a sentence, The air didn't just shift, it solidified. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's eyes widened in confusion, then something that looked suspiciously like fear. Julian, however, barked out a laugh. "Oh, very funny, Serafina," trying to steal the moment. Brielle didn't laugh. She leaned back, a hand resting lightly on the table, her eyes narrowing as she reevaluated everything she knew. "A prosecutor," she repeated softly, testing the word. Then her eyes snapped open with recognition. "Wait, the prosecutor Serafina Cole, the one who handled the City Hall corruption case last quarter." Silence, a silence that held the entire room captive. "You interviewed me," Brielle continued, her voice gaining strength. "I was a material witness for the defense. You were relentless, direct. I had no idea that was your sister, Julian." She looked from me to Julian, her face a mask of dawning astonishment and professional respect. "She's the reason the opposition caved." Julian's laughter died in his throat. "What are you talking about? She's admin." "I know what a paralegal looks like, Julian," Brielle said, her voice now cold and certain. "And I know what a chief deputy prosecutor looks like. She's one of the best." My father finally spoke, his voice cracked with disbelief. "A prosecutor, for how long?" 5 years, I replied evenly. "I started as an assistant state attorney, working my way up." Julian pushed his chair back, his face crimson. "You let us believe, you let me make jokes. You did this to embarrass me." I held his gaze, calm and steady. "You never asked for the truth, Julian. You asked for a convenient label. I simply stopped correcting the story you preferred." He glared at me, then at Brielle, who was regarding him with a chilling disappointment. He had lost control of the room, and for the first time he looked truly vulnerable. "This is my night," he sputtered, his voice shaking. "Yes," I agreed quietly, "and you chose to use it to diminish me." He turned and strode away, leaving a gaping hole in the conversation and in the narrative of his perfect evening. When the room had settled and Brielle had followed Julian, my mother reached across the table, her fingers tracing the back of my hand. "Why, Serafina, why keep a secret that big?" I didn't pull away, I simply answered with the truth I'd finally owned. "Because every time I tried to be fully seen, you only focused on him." The next morning the silence was over. The phone calls, the long texts from stunned family members, the clumsy apologies, they all arrived. I didn't answer them. I felt a profound sense of relief, the kind of lightness that comes from finally dropping a heavy, unnecessary burden. The truth is, I had been taught that peace was achieved by being small. Now I finally understood, you do not owe anyone a smaller version of yourself to keep the peace. The right people will respect your rise.